Well, welcome for those of you who are here with us in person and those who are joining us on our YouTube channel. My name is Luca Somigli. I am the chair of the Department of Italian Studies and the Goggio chair in Italian Studies. As always, it is my pleasure to introduce our Goggio series, and in this case, also introduce our speaker today. This is the second in a sequence of three lectures on a connected theme of memory, trauma, and migration by Professor Margherita Ganeri, who is full professor of contemporary Italian literature at the University of Calabria, where she's also the founding director of the Seminar Italian Diaspora Studies. She's on the board of directors of the journal Moderna and directs the book series Italian Diaspora Studies for the publisher Rubbettino. She has received 2 Fulbright fellowships and has been appointed visiting professor at various universities, including, I like to mention my alma mater, Stony Brook University, but she's also been at Cambridge, the Italian School of Middlebury, the University of Chicago, here in Canada, the University of Saskatchewan, and several others. She has a wide record of publications, including 10 authored books and more than 50 essays in various international journals and scholarly volumes. I will mention only a few of her many publications. You otherwise won't have time for her talk. Il romanzo storico in Italia, il dibattito critico dalle origini al postmoderno, came out in 1999. Pirandello romanziere, 2001. And L'Europa in Sicilia, saggi su Federico De Roberto, 2005. And the most recent Ritagli critici sulla letteratura italiana contemporanea, just came out in 2023, as well as a book on Helen Barolini, entitled Italian America, Epos and Storytelling in Helen Barolini, the subject of her talk today. The title of which you see on display here, Memory, Trauma, and Calabria, a tribute to Helen Barolini. Please join me in welcoming again Margherita for the second stop in our tour.
Thank you very much, Luca. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I'm gonna have deliver another lecture next Tuesday. I hope we can cut the introduction. No, I'm just kidding. It's a joke. So I'm very happy to be here, even though the weather is, for me, it's really cold. But I have to sit down because I have to work on my slides here. As you can see on the screen in my back. This lecture is connected with the one they gave last week because of the thematic thread, the memory, trauma, and the south of Italy. In this case, it's not Sicily, of course, for those of you who were here last time, but it's Calabria because Helen Barolini is an Italian American from the United States with Calabrese roots. For me, it's a real pleasure and an honor to be given this lecture today in honor of Helen Barolini, because as you can see here in the slides, she died March 29, 2023. So it's 1 year. So this is her anniversary almost for a few days. So I'm very happy to be able to talk about her here today. It's like also a celebration for her. Okay. Before starting, I want to do the land acknowledgement here. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of several Indigenous people, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be a guest and to work today on this land. So before jumping into my topic, before starting talking about Helen Barolini, I decided very briefly to give an overview of a couple of issues that are related to to this topic. First of all, in the slide that you see here, this slide, I've put this title, Italian American Literature, ? Because of course there is a history of the Italian Americans. Americans in this case means people from the United States, which is, you know, as Umberto Eco wrote, it's a problematic definition itself. It shouldn't be American used only for the United States, of course. But this is not the topic. The point is, should we still talk today, use this formula, Italian American literature? Well, there is a debate. Some people think yes, other things no. I'm personally on the side of the people who think no, not anymore. We should use the expression Italian diaspora literature from the United States as well as from Canada or other countries. But this formula, Italian American literature, was used to at least 20-25 years. Even though Italians arrived in the United States, the big, so-called Great Migration, the great wave of Italians in the United States, traces us back, as we all know, 1880s, and then going on the first decades of the 20th century. The debate on literature started much later. And in the slide, at the bottom of this slide, you'll see this anthology from the margin. The title itself suggests the idea. The anthology is edited by Anthony Tamburi, Fred Cardofè, Paolo Giordano, describes the debate on Italian American literature. It came out in 1991. So at that time, in the 80s, in the 70s, has been very poor inside and very almost non-existent still. And in Italy at that time, in the 90s, it was absolutely not, nobody talked, nobody knew what it was as Italian American literature. So today there is a debate, as you can see, the Italian American, the Routledge History of Italian American, that's a very important book that came out in 2017 and was translated into Italian. But this book does not really focus only on literature. It's the history of the Italian Americans and the cultural artifacts of the Italian American. The PBS series, TV series here, you have the DVD, it's the same. So if you talk about Italian American, it's still fine. If you talk about Italian American literature, well, that's questionable, okay? Very fast going on and over, excuse me. So I prefer to use the formal Italian diaspora varieties from the USA. And of course, there were Italian diaspora writers from the USAs in the 30s and later on in the 40s and the 60s. So my point is that the debate on Italian American literature was absent, the critical debate, the academic debate. But these writers existed, they were well known, and some of them more than the others. Some of them, like Mario Puzo, became very famous, of course, because of the film, The Godfather, that everybody knows, but they weren't recognized as members of a field, of a literary field that was recognized in academia. Among the most important writers in the USA, some of them were from Calabria. Maybe the most interesting one is Gay Talese, still alive, who published this book. It's a very important book, Into the Suns, that's based on the story of his family. It's a novel, but it's inspired by the family history based in Calabria and Maida. And Gay Talese published this novel in 1992, but the following year published this very provocative article on the New York Times Book Review, in which he argued that Italian Americans with literary aspiration had been held back not just by discrimination in academia and publishing, but also by their disregard for education, disdain for reading, and reference to omertà, the tradition of keeping family secrets. The title was a very provocative one, as I said. Where are the Italian American novelists today? And so this article by Guy Talese created a very lively debate, and Helen Barolini replied, was an important central figure on this debate against Guy Talese, as we will see in a few minutes. A little bit later of their male counterparts, there was a large series of women writers of Italian diaspora from the USA that became well known. They started publishing. It was difficult for me to select only some, but this just a few, but there are many others. And in fact, today, the Italian diaspora literary scenes in the United States is mostly characterized by the presence of important, outstanding women writers, more women writers than men, and this is interesting. So one is Tina De Rosa. I'm also including these writers to give suggestions for students that would like to read. Paperfish is a great book. Vertigo by Luis De Favo is fantastic. Maria Mazziotti Gillian, she's very dear to me. We work together. So I put also the cover of the book. We co-edited recently. The book is celebrating Calabria. And, it's still very alive, the topic of diaspora in this literature. For example, this very young writer, Juliet Grimes, that writes on Calabria. She became, with the first novel, which is a fantastic novel. So if you have the chance, please read it. I really love it. And is the 7th or 8th death of Stella Fortuna. Is totally, completely based in Calabria. She is a 5th generation American Calabrese writer, and the new novel is coming up soon. So there is a lot of interesting materials in this field, still today, still in the 5th generation. And I must say, I'm proud, I'm happy, more than proud, I'm happy to say that most of these women writers talk about the south of Italy, of course, for obvious reasons, because their roots are in the south of Italy, and many of them, in a very new, innovative, interesting way, they talk about Calabria, as Juliet Graves. All this was started by Helen Barolini. So Helen Barolini published in 1985 this Break-In anthology. It was the first anthology, the first ever anthology about Italian American women. And Helen Barolini doesn't use the formula, please note in the title of the slide, Italian American women writers. She talks about writings by Italian American women. So that's anticipates what I told you already. So Italian American women and not Italian American writers. And regarding herself, Helen Barolini defined herself as a 100% American writer, but as an Italian American person, a woman. So there is this shift. So in this first anthology, that is the first in assoluto, it was published before From the Margin that I quoted before. She claims that the Italian American female writer was discriminated 3 times. She was emarginated as an immigrant or as a descendant of immigrants, as a woman in a patriarchal Italian family, and as a writer in a still male-dominated literary world. From this very short quote, I think it's easy, probably, already it's possible to understand that Helen Barolini was a feminist. She was considered a pioneering figure in this field because she was the one that collected, but also the materials were looking into who were the writers, the dispersed writers, replying, even though she wrote that before, to that question Gaeta Lese poses on the sword, where are the Italian American novelists? So Helen Barolini sort of said there are, but nobody knows them because of this hegemonic perspective. They don't want to see them where they are. And she also was a pioneering figure because of this feminine view of the issue. And this quote, she defines the Italian heritage as a pernicious heritage. More than for men, the displacement from one culture to another has represented the real crisis of identity for Italian women, as she has left a heritage of conflict to her children. The children end up in their assimilationist hurry, which is I really like this expression, with shame and ambivalence in their behavior and values. And this pernicious heritage has been passed on. Even third and fourth generation feel the remnants of it. So she has a sort of this prophetic view of what's going to happen to the following. So she talks about an intergenerational connection and trauma that starts with the first women who emigrated to the other. So, of course, the publication of this anthology is very important in the field of Italian American studies. Helen Barolini, however, partially changed her mind, and she published 15 years later a second edition of this book, this revised edition in 2000, in which she still presents the feminist topics. So she insists on the women internal barriers, the external barriers, of course, she already described in the first edition, but the internal barriers are what are more important for her at a later stage of her reflection. And she proposed she was very much influenced by the German American anti-Freudian psychoanalyst Karen Horney, and from her she takes this idea of the feminist self-actualization, which is a word she uses for empowerment and even feminist activist. But in this case, in the second edition, she writes a preface, which is one of the best essays she's ever wrote. It's a very important theoretical text, the second edition to this book. She says, she claims that she didn't want to fight for a recognition of a specific group of writers. So the Dream Book was intended not as an act of separatism, of setting a specific ethnic group apart from the main body of the American literature, but as an act of inclusion and completion to restore the body of the national literature in the body, the names of women authors who had been overlooked. And this national literature she has in mind is the American literature, not the Italian American or not the Italian diaspora. So she partially changed the idea in a way after she was registering in her reflection, in her theoretical and critical reflection, that change that were in society, in the late 90s. But anyway, she was an outstanding figure, pioneering figure. Now, Helen, Italian heritage. She was born in Syracuse, New York. Helen Frances Mollica was last name. Barolini is her husband's last name. Her paternal grandparents emigrated from Sicily. Her maternal ones from Calabria. She wrote that the ones from Calabria were always much closer to her. She spent more time with, especially the grandmother, who you see that in this picture. She's a very important figure because she's a protagonist of the most important novel. I mean, she's not the protagonist, that's a novel, but the character, the protagonist of that novel is clearly inspired to this figure, the grandmother. Her name was Nicoletta Cardamone. She emigrated to Utica, New York State in 1880. Helen, in 1950, married the well-known intellectual and poet Antonio Barolini, and they had three daughters, Teolinda, Susanna, and Nicoletta, which I want to thank them very much because they've been very nice with me. After the death of the mother, they gave me the unpublished material, which I'm currently working on those. And you may know Teodolinda Barolini is a very famous university professor, Dante scholars at Columbia University. So Helen lived many years in Italy, mostly in Rome, but also in Vicenza, where his family was, and came back to the United States after the death of the husband. She published many books, as you will see in the next slide, but unanimously, everybody thinks this is the masterpiece by Helen Barolini. It's the historical novel Umbertina was published first edition in 1979, so before the Dream Book, and then a second most well-known edition in 1999 by the Feminist Press, which is interesting, published also in Italian. So I'm gonna basically dedicate the rest of my time to Umbertina. But before, I want to just mention a little bit of her other book. She is was a prolific writer who was several collection of poetries, like, for example, the Haiku collection 2009. Those are fabulous. Other novels, Love in the Middle Ages, Crossing the Alps, and the last one, Visits, in 2016. But she also wrote about something else, like Aldous and His Dream Book. That's a very fantastic book. Came out in 1992. It's a divulgative historical book. She worked in archival. It's the life of Aldo Manuzio, very famous intellectual and editor in Venezia. The book is full of nice illustrations from the Francesco Colonna, Ipnomerarchia Polifili. So she is a very educated writer who had worked in archival on different things. So she's not simply an author of narratives. But among all these books, I think the other two books that are really important also to read and understand and interpret Umbertina are these two: one, Chiaroscuro, Essays of Identity, and came out in 1995, translated into Italian in 2005, and A Circular Journey, 2016. In these two books, those are collection of short essays. Some of them have the form of memoir, so narrative, memoir, essays, reflections. The word itself, chiaroscuro, clearly shows the thing, but also a circular journey. So in everything Helen Barolini wrote, as in these two books becomes very clear, there is the centrality of memory and its relationship with trauma. And the two things are conceived as an endless circular journey. Calabria is very much present in all these reflections. A recurring self-identifying image is that of the turtle of Calabria. This is the title of one of the pieces in Chiaroscuro, but the image of the turtle is always quoted again in other pieces. I am a turtle out of Calabria. This is what Helen writes. And the three main characteristics to explain this metaphor, this allegory, is resilient, testa dura, hard-headed, and a person who preserves memory and relics. The word testa dura allows me to say that very often Helen never wrote in Italian. As I said before, she's a 100% American writer. I write only in English, but she learned Italian very well. She uses a lot of Italian words, also dialect words, and also Italiese words. So even though she says I'm a 100% American writer, but her writings very often shows this intercultural substrate that's really important. So there is Italian underneath. And not only the Italian that she learned as an adult living in Italy with his husband, but the Italian that was spoken by her grandmother, the dialect, and so on. So Calabria is important for Helen. And this traces back to the memory of the grandmother. For the grandmother, Calabria was an inner locus. My grandmother had moved her physical whereabouts in the world, but not her inner locus. This is a circular journey. My grandparents felt grateful for the rest of their lives in getting safely to America, where they could give their children a future rather than the burdens of the past. And yet, nothing is that simple, especially the ties and the binds of one's beginnings. Where one grew up remains the backdrop of one's mind, the panorama against which everything else is played out. And this is true for the grandparents, but it's also true for the descendants, for Helen itself. Calabria is like a backdrop of one mind. But which Calabria? The grandmother emigrated, Nicoletta Cardamone emigrated from this very small little village called Castagna, means chestnut in English. Today is an hamlet of Carlopoli, and these are just some pigs, which has this very important, today totally in ruin, abbey. The Corazzo Abbey now is in the territory of Carlopoli because Castagna itself is part of Carlopoli. but it's right there. Castagna, the abbey was there. This is a very important, one of the most important actually in the South Abbey, Norman Abbey, in the 11th and 12th century, very flourished, where Gioacchino Fiore had his first base. These are just some pics of Sila. Castagna, Carlopoli are in the Sila, the National Park of Sila is a gigantic park. Sila is divided in three parts. Sila Grande, Sila Piccola, Sila Greca, the Greek Sila, the big Sila, the small Sila. Castagna is in the so-called small Sila. Those are just images. In Umbertina, the first part of, as I said, Umbertina is a historical novel. It's not a memoir, it's a novel. But a novel that is based on real inspirational figures. Umbertina is the name, the fictional game given to the figure of the grandmother. So Nicoletta was in reality. So the book is divided in three large parts. It tells the story of 4 generations for all women, the 4 women of this Longobardi family. The first one is Umbertina, and Umbertina is the emigrant, the woman that from Calabria went to the United States. Then there is the daughter, Karl, who is less important in the novel. I'll explain why later. Then there is Marguerite, who's the protagonist, and corresponds to the generation of the writer. And then there is the daughter, the great-granddaughter of Umbertina, who corresponds to the generation of Teodolinda and Susanna. What is really important in this novel is the first part. It's the reconstruction, the invention of this figure of Umbertina. It's a fantastic figure. This woman is Pastorella, a goth girl that is very strong. This is the beginning of the novel, of the section of the novel dedicated to this character. So 1860, 1940, because she was born in 1860, died 1940. And she had hazel eyes, but in the village people said of Umbertina that she had character right from the womb. She'll be the man of the family. So Umbertina is humble, is illiterate, but is very strong, and very often there are parallelisms with her, she's the real man. She's strong, she's resilient, she's determined, and she is the person that wanted to emigrate and is also the member of the family, thanks to who the family was successful in the United States. So in the first parts of this part dedicated to Umbertina, there are description of the world in which Umbertina lived before emigrating. And I must say that what is really remarkable is that the writer Helen Barolini carried on an impressively comprehensive historical research in order to write this book. She's very well informed about history, about anthropology, culture, and another very important aspect is that she is very, very well able to express the point of view of an illiterate person with a very strong feminist perspective in which Umbertina becomes sort of an intellectual. She becomes somebody who understands a lot, even though she doesn't have culture at all. Now, Calabria, because I'm interested in Calabria, as you see the title, so it's presented in the Umbertina eyes since the beginning as an abandoned and old area. It's old Calabria. Helen Barolini was a reader. She was a very educated person. She was very much influenced by the great tour narrators, and especially by Norman Douglas' Old Calabria. But she was influenced at the same time she was against them. There is this internal fight in what she writes. There is to say, I became part of the hegemonic culture in Italy because Antonio Barolini, the husband, was high educated culture, friend of Montale. She lives and knows all the most important writers. I put here the cover of Christ Stopped in Eboli because she became close friends of Carlo Levi, but also Calvino and many others. So she was part of this intellectual elite in Italy, which she talks in Umbertina. There is a description of the one Premio Strega from 1973 besides. But even though the husband, not very nicely, would repeat to her very often, sorry to say that, but I don't think it's nice. She would say to her, I could marry you because you have been depurated by the emigration. Otherwise, I am a Veneto man. I could never marry somebody from Calabria. But on the other hand, Helen has these grandparents that her origins are there. So she questions the Southern question and a lot of stereotypes against the South. Stereotypes are very, very common also in books like Old Calabria by Norman Douglas, even though he was in favor of Calabria. He had sympathy for Calabria, but it's a sympathy that's still seen, in which Calabria is still seen from a superior point of view. So Umbertina has this vision, but the vision that Umbertina has is a documentation, is a proof, realistic depiction of the fact that she didn't have any culture. So she knew that the abbey in which the valley meant that Castagna was an old place, not a new one. That's all she knew. And there is this imagination of the new word. She doesn't know what the new word is, but she's attracted by the new word. Another very interesting point is the Italian identity of Umbertina. Umbertina describes what happens in Soveria Mannelli, which is the largest city. I mean, it's a town close to Carlopoli, where Garibaldi there was a very important battaglia, Garibaldi, and there is the monument there. So she says, Umbertina goes to the marketplace in Soveria Mannelli, and she saw men in the uniform of Italy, a country she knew no more of than of America, so she didn't know anything. But she heard her father and other men talk, and they would shake their heads and complain about what this new country, Italy, was doing to them. It was a new thing to be Italian, and the men said it brought new troubles. Taxes had come on salt and even flour milling, so the poor could no longer afford their daily bread. So see, there is a concrete, realistic, documented historical narration, but it's all presented from the point of view of an illiterate character. And I think in this sense, this book is unique in representing this perspective. It's really a peasant novel in this section, a novel in which a shepherd, the goat girl, it's really the narrating voice is the protagonist of the view. So Umbertina decided to go. She decided to marry Serafino instead of another man who wanted to marry her, but he didn't want to go to the United States. So she is against romantic love, and she will keep a little tin heart as an amulet, as an object that will always remember her that she made a choice. She renounced love, and she decided to go away. So this is a proof that she was really an activist sort of alive. So they are living. The description of the journey is very moving, very touching. They left Castagna with their last possessions, a donkey bearing the children, the bundles. Serafino is much weaker than her. He cries, also because Serafino, who's older than Umbertina, had been to America already. He had to come back because he got really sick. So, as we can see here, he knew that his strength was less now than it had been 15 years ago. If he hadn't won America over then, how would he do so now? And in fact, Serafino will not win America. Will not win America. It's Serafina, it's Umbertina that became the one who saved the situation. So they were transient in the land of their fathers, eating away like ghosts. It gave them a queer sense to be adrift between the old country and the new, belonging to neither. the journey impressed her with the feeling of place. Wherever it might be, one had to have a place in the world. So this is the problem of having or missing better a place. This is the issue, the trauma that from the generation who emigrated passes on the following ones until the writers and the new generation still. Not having a place, feeling displaced, losing, feeling not here, not there. But again, as I said, this part is very well documented. Serafino and Umbertina travels to Calabria to get to the sea where they had the embarkment there to go to America. So this section, the description of Cosenza and the malaria, is really accurate. This is so accurate that I really think, and I've done that, I've suggested that to do in Calabria, that you could use this book to study the history of the period. And then finally arrive in Paola. Paola was the leaving point. Paola, which is my town, as you know, it was the point of departure of the Tyrrhenian area, of the emigrants of the Tyrrhenian area. People were desperate there. Of course, Paola is the town of St. Francis of Paola, the famous saint who's a protector of the sailors and also protector of the immigrants. So Umbertina, they are there and they're waiting for, you know, they are hopeless on the shores of Paola. And the Dazio, the people of the Dazio arrives there. And this is also very interesting. They laugh at the immigrants. They want to take taxes of them. They laughed at them. So you can see that the local police, local political representation had lots to say against, you know, and lots of responsibilities in what was happening. And then also the priests they were waiting for to have a last sign of hope. They don't arrive. They are on the shore, and there is dark, and they are waiting. So very moving passages. They stayed there in the growing dark. The whole group of them huddled together with their children. A few children whimpered, many slept in the mother's arm. They were waiting for the priest and his voice of reassurance. It was somehow fitting that they should live at night, slipping away like shadows from the country that had not wanted to hold them. So this is the way they live. But nonetheless, they carried on something from the old world. And there is only this specific object defined in the text. The one thing Umbertina wants to bring back is the coperta matrimoniale, called in Italian in the text, coperta matrimoniale. I want a coperta matrimoniale for the wedding bed, Umbertina said. Such I have seen hanging from balconies, so Maria Manelli on Corpus Christi there. The bedspread was the only thing she would bring to her new home, and she in America, and she wanted beautiful and strong to last forever. It was in the traditional design of the countryside. Now there is a story in the novel because she is forced to sell the coperta matrimoniale to survive, and this saves her family, but it is a big traumatic thing to do for her, and it was lost. The person who sold it, who bought it, was another Italian who took advantages of Umbertina. So that's interesting. But then Tina, the great granddaughter, found that exposed in a museum later on, and she admired that bedspread without knowing that was the one of Umbertina. So of course, it's a symbol that has a recurrence. But to prove once again that the writer documented herself very well, the description of the coperta, it's really it's the real Sila from the Sila traditional loom tapestry. This is one of the most important laboratories in San Giovanni in Fiore, where the Maestro Caruso is very famous there, that teaches how to do that. And he explained us, because we went there with several groups, that all these patterns have specific meanings. symbologies, religious, but not only religious meaning, and then some of them traces back before medieval time. So it's really history, it's really interesting. So the coperta was one of the most important things that she keeps in the New World. The other one is the rosemary. I don't have time to talk now, but this plant that goes with Umbertina and with the descendants of Umbertina. And the third one, strong one, is the water. So in 1940, when Umbertina dies, I'm going to read this passage because it was 1940. Italy, she heard, had entered the war. How everything seemed to repeat itself. Her vision dimmed so that Jack, Amelia, and Ben, and Karl, and the others at their bedstead became dim gray shadows. And then a sudden brightening came to her eyes, as in a vision of light. She saw the lost coperta of her matrimonial bed, with all the intensity of its colors and bright twinnings of leaves and flowers. Ah, she gasped at its beauty. As Jake leaned over to hear her better, she asked for a cup of water from the spring. What spring, Mamma? He asked. Castagna, she whispered. Then she was gone. So, of course, as the inner place, the elusive inner place that I mentioned before, Umbertina never wanted to go back, never returned to Calabria, never wanted to go back. In the last year of her life, before dying, she's painted represented in the novel as it was in the reality, because we have a text written by the writer, as a tragic figure, because she was successful as a businesswoman. Her family was healthy, but she was tragic because she was isolated with the family. She never learned English. She never learned Italian. She spoke only the old dialect, not well. So she cannot talk with her grandchildren. She's different from the other grandmothers. She's dressed in black. She's different. She is a person suspended, not anymore in Calabria, not really here in the United States. And she has preserved Castagna in Calabria inside herself. When she's dying, the all beautiful image that she sees is the coperta and the water from Castagna. And the water, of course, is very rich symbols of life. And so Umbertina still preserves this sense of the origin, even though she has to cut her ties and never return, never look backward. Now, the first generation Carla, as anticipated, is a minor character in the novel. Carla is one of the 7 children of Umbertina. That's because, and this is also historically well documented, the first generation born in the United States is very much pressed by the assimilation process. So Carla didn't care about the Italian origin. She has a very strong resistance. She wants to be 100% American. Everything that's American is good, everything that's Italian is bad. And she had also a negative influence on her daughter, Marguerite, which is the 3rd generation, 2nd generation born in the United States, because Marguerite wanted to recuperate this Italian roots. And she wanted to study Italian language and wanted to visit Italy, which she did. But her mother was always against her in a very terrible way. So much that she talked to her like, you are mad. So there was this maledizione of her mother on Marguerite because Marguerite wanted to feel Italian or recuperate something of this feeling. So Carla is an interesting but marginal character. Marguerite, however, is very important. However, this character fails totally. There is a failure in this regard. She's the one who wants to look for her roots. She's the one that moves to Italy and then to Rome. Married an Italian man, so it's the same biographical patterns of the writer. As soon as she arrives in Rome, she starts a psychoanalytic therapy, even though she calls it sometimes psychiatric. the two things are very different, but she uses in the same way. So the doctor name is a Sicilian doctor called Dr. Verdile. And actually, the beginning of the novel, the prologue of the novel, is we see this psychoanalytic setting in which the doctor, the psychoanalyst, tells her, in order to start your process of healing, you should write something on your roots and your great grandmother. So the whole section dedicated to Umbertina is, in fact, as in La Coscienza di Zeno, for those who are familiar with that, it's something that the client, the client writes for the therapy. However, this is very postmodern aspect. This aspect is totally lost in the novel, because then we have the whole long section of Umbertina and no references anymore to Marguerite, and no reference to this doctor. Then there is the new section, parte 2, part 2, on Marguerite, but we still don't see the doctor anymore. And then in chapter 15, very far away, the doctor appears again. But in that case, the text says, Dr. Verdile, who was his psychiatrist in Rome, of course, because the reader would have forgotten. So we don't know what happened with that therapy. So we don't know why Marguerite interrupted the therapy, what happened. This is intentionally suspended. It like the construction of the novel has a weakness there. I personally think that it makes it even more interesting, because the trauma thing, you lose tracks of something. There is not even that, the polemicizing about psychoanalysts. It's just something that starts and goes there, and who knows what happens. But what is really interesting, it's why, for me, it's really interesting that Marguerite is a counterpart of the writer. It's the same generation, same experiences. But on the contrary, why the writer succeeds and she fails totally. She plans to go to Calabria and to Castagna. She desires that very much in the novel, but she never reaches out. Of course, the writer, he reaches out. She went to visit Castagna, Calabria in 1967. So Marguerite doesn't. So for Marguerite, Calabria is forbidden in the novel. And then eventually she dies, commits suicide, even though it's a car accident, it's ambiguous, can be an accident or a suicide, more likely a suicide, while she was pregnant. So the abortion thing. So in my point of view, it's interesting, the question why the writer created a character that corresponds to her, but with the opposite results. She was successful in that, the color character. So I have talking about this in my book. So if you are interested, there are more things in the book. So it's the fourth generation, the great-granddaughter Tina, that actually completes that journey, even though it's always a circular journey. But Tina goes to Calabria. She's able to go to Calabria and to Castagna. This journey is very interesting for several different reasons. First of all, she travels down the south with a man, accompanying man, his name is Ferruccio, who's a very educated Tuscan Florentine man who goes with her, yes, but every minute talks against Calabria and especially against Castagna. He kept saying, why would you go there? There's nothing to see there. There's nothing to see in Castagna. I don't understand. You're an educated person, because Tina has already finished a degree at the university. She's gonna start an academic career. So he's a representative of the idea that the north, or the south of Italy, and especially Calabria, are places that there are subaltern places with no culture, nothing to go to see, and they're not attractive for tourism either. And one example, now I'm not going to read everything but the one interesting example is the reference to the Bretti. The Brutti are called, in fact. Ferruccio says, these Brutti, Now, Bretti, the Brettian was a local population, of course, as everybody knows, descendant from the Onotrians. They were discriminated by the Romans, first of all. Many Roman historians called the Bretti brutti. Brutti, it means ugly, and barbarians. That's also because the Bretti were a strong population, and the Romans had problems in fighting with them. They eventually defeated them, but it took a long time. So there were all this difficult, there was discrimination against them. But one of the things the Romans said that they didn't have any culture. They used to live in very primitive ways on the mountains, away barbarians, like primitive people, which is something not true. Archaeological research has proved the contrary. And also, it's very important, especially in the Cosenza province, this area, the Bretti went along very well with the Greeks. In fact, the Sibari, now this is going to be a long story, but if you're interested, you ask me later. Sibari, the Greek colony of Sibari, had very good relationship with the local population. And this is why it became very powerful. And the other Greek cities fought all together against Sibari, and they defeated. But, in Sibari was marriages among the noble members of the classes that they were allowed. We have documents. So they could intermarry. And in fact, after a couple of centuries, the artifacts, the temples, the houses became very similar. And Cosenza was the capital of the Bretti. So Ferruccio says these Bretti were really horrible people, hostile. And Tina says, oh, che bello. She was happy to be there. It's bello, I like to see that. And in another passage I didn't quote here, she says, I felt so happy to be descendants of the Bretti. So this is, again, it's in that provocative, counter-narrative thing. I mean, the commonplace, the prejudice is Calabria is inferior, there is nothing in Calabria, the Bretti were inferior, and then on the other hand, the writer talks, no, they were nice, I'm happy to be descendants of them. So this is all very interesting. However, even Tina find that when she reaches Castania, she loves the ruins, of course, of the monastery of the abbey, but she thinks all the rest is a desert. No people were there, they are abandoned. And so she starts thinking about himself, why did I come here? But more and more, she seemed to herself an intruder in a place that was as much ruin as the monastery below them. What was the use of pursuing Umbertina, she asked herself. This coming to Castania had been more to lose herself than to find Umbertina. What had she in common with the impoverished hovels of this place, with the isolation and backwardness? She was now a product of education. There was no return. Umbertina's message, in fact, was leave, take a direction, go forward, do not look back. And yet she was there because no message could overcome her feelings of having to be there. So this character, she brings to the conscious, fa diventare cosciente, brings to consciousness the internal conflict. On one hand, I'm a product of education. There is no return. This idea there is nostos, but no return. On the other hand, this sense of the feelings of having to be there. And even when she returns to the United States afterwards, at the end of the trip, she keeps thinking about this trip to Calabria, not the trip to Italy in general, only Calabria. So the trip to Calabria every so often flashed through her mind, like glinting pieces of a mosaic that she tried to shape into a whole, a pattern of serious design. But it was surreal, like pieces in a kaleidoscope, which never regroup in the same configuration, but with each shake of the memory go into some new interpretation of their parts. So Calabria was fragments only. So Calabria is a kaleidoscope of fragments. So to summarize of all these, what is Calabria in this book? Calabria is an object of desire. I can add an elusive object of desire, always. All the objects of desire are elusive. It is in between reality and the subconscious. It's the omphalos of the origin. You can renounce the origin. You look for the origin, but you can never reach there. It's a black hole. It's always going to be an empty place. So this is a double dynamic. There's no return, but I have the feelings of having to be there. Now, to conclude, because we consider this feeling of having to be there one of the point of our some of the missions that we have at the Italian Diaspora Studies seminar at the University of Calabria. So I want to conclude by quoting something that we organized in 2017. It was June 2017. So we did the Umbertina tour, and on the map you see Castagna, and there are two roads that you can go. Of course, the road on the coastline is an easy road, and the other one, the internal one, is the old road. And from Castagna to Paola, going by car today on the old road, you know, it takes like 8 hours. Can you imagine previous, you know, when Umbertina was fine? So we did that from Castagna to Paola, and it was in one of the summer seminars that we had, and then that year there was a conference, the Italian American Studies Association, American one from the United States, they organized the first conference outside the United States for their 50th anniversary. So that was the group there at Abbazia di Corazzo, the group in Castagna. That's the church where Umbertina and Serafino got married, even though it became yellow. That's how they they do restoration in Calabria. But anyway, with the mayor of Carropoli explaining, the group all'Abbazia di Corazzo, and the food that was very good, because we worked with a restaurant there, asked them to reproduce exactly the food quoted in the novel for the wedding of Umbertina. And they did it. And they cook it in a whole way, 8 hours cooking. Of course, it's got cheese, got meat. It was delicious. Then we had a very good group of ethnomusicologists to explain which local folk instruments they were using, and also the dances, teaching the people how to dance. That specific Rubbettino, that area is called Tarantella. And then we ended up in Paola. This restaurant has a terrace on the beach, exactly on that place where the immigrants gathered, waiting for the little boats to go to the ship and then to embark in Naples. I'm done. Thank you.